visions of the dark night, I have dreamed of joy departed. But a waking dream of life and light hath left me broken-hearted. Ah, what is not a dream by day, to him whose eyes are cast on things around him with a ray, turned back upon the past? That holy dream, while all the world were chiding, hath cheered me as a lovely beam, a lonely spirit guiding. What though that light through storm and night so trembled from afar? What could there be more purely bright in truth's day star?
Welcome, my ghouls, to the Phantasmagorium on this glorious October evening, only 10 days before Halloween. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. Tonight, we take you to a Halloween party that you may have attended as a child. One with costumes, candy, fun, and a game of hide and seek. We now present The Blue Boy. I always think of this story around Halloween. I was 8 years old when it happened, but this story will stick with me forever. I've told a lot of people about this, and the common opinion seems to be that it's either creepy as heck or total bullshit. I think that's just sad. As I said, when I was 8 years old, I went to stay with some cousins up in the north of England in their farmhouse during the October half-term. I was living off the buzz of feeling independent for the first time ever, since my parents were staying back in London and my cousins were a couple of years older, 9, 11, and twin 13-year-olds, and a lot more independent than I was. I didn't know my dad's side of the family well, and I had only met them once before going to stay with them. However, I wasn't an awkward kid and made friends with everyone pretty easily. So my parents had no worries about me making friends with my cousins. I settled in quickly and loved the lack of rules around where you could go and what I could do without parental supervision, since my cousins took me to play in the woods and fields next to the farm pretty much every day. My 8-year-old self was delighted by the freedom of making campfires, paddling in the stream, and staying out after dark with my cousins. We got to watch horror movies that my parents wouldn't dream of letting me watch, and stay up way later than at home. Plus, we got to eat sweets and drink fizzy drinks whenever we wanted them. I felt like I was living the dream. If you can't tell, I remember having a thoroughly good time and was even too busy to even miss my parents all that much. I was also delighted to discover that every year, my cousins hosted a big Halloween party at the farmhouse, in which they and their parents had guests. Something I was particularly excited about, as my parents had never been that into Halloween at home. My cousins had invited around 25 kids between them as guests, making 30 kids including the 5 of us, and their parents were having guests too. I remember the excitement of getting ready in our costumes with my cousins in the attic room of the farmhouse, eating ungodly amounts of sweets while admiring our spooky attire in the mirror. I was dressed in a slightly too big devil costume that had previously belonged to my cousins. Around 100 guests arrived from what I remember, and we found that my aunt and uncle had lit the huge garden with fairy lights since it was getting dark earlier as the clocks had gone back. At the Halloween party, I bobbed for apples, carved pumpkins, and played games with the other kids and had a pretty great time. I didn't know anybody other than my cousins, obviously, but as I said, I was an extrovert kid and was just happy to be there, so I excitedly chatted with everyone. When it was about twilight, all the kids decided to head to the woods to play a big game of hide and seek. I should probably mention that although this sounds like neglectful parenting on behalf of my aunt and uncle, it wasn't all that unsafe in context. An entrance to the woods was literally at the bottom of their garden across a field, and my cousins spent half of their lives playing in them. It was quite a safe area, and there was a limit on how far the adults said we were allowed to go, even with torches. So, we ran down to the woods, and my cousins set up some lanterns to stay permanently on at a small clearing with a big hollow tree stump that all the other kids seemed to know was base for hide and seek. All of us kids were clustered around a huge tree stump, and it was decided that my oldest twin cousins would count while the rest of us would hide. Before I knew it, everyone had scampered off in every direction, torchlight flashing in the darkening woods. Most of the kids were local and knew the woods well enough to know the best hiding places. However, I still had to keep my torch trained on the ground to avoid gnarled roots and fallen branches. I had planned to try and hide with someone else, but they were too quick for me and were already disappearing into the dark trees in every direction. So, I chose a random path and ran downhill, flashing my torch to look for somewhere I could hide while remembering my bearings back to the tree stump. I hadn't gotten far before I tripped on some uneven ground, fell and dropped my torch, and everything went dark. In the few seconds that I was fumbling to turn my torch back on and flash it around, I must have flashed it upward, because I saw another kid hiding in a wide fork of a tree. It was an amazing hiding place, easy to climb to, not far from base, and couldn't be seen from ground level.
"Can I hide with you?"
I whisper shouted. The kid nodded, so I clambered into the fork beside him. It was high enough that you could see into the clearing where my cousins were counting, but dark enough that they wouldn't notice us.
"Hey, this is such a cool spot,"
I whispered, aware of the distant voices of my cousins counting. They were reaching the late 90s and would be seeking soon.
"Thank you. Yeah, I know,"
he said, turning to me and smiling shyly.
"I always come to this spot. Not a lot of people know about it,"
he said. I turned to look at his costume in the dim torchlight.
"What are you, a zombie?"
I said. It was a good costume. Pale bluish face powder and gaunt skeletal shadows drawn with SFX makeup to make him look like he was something out of The Walking Dead.
"I tried to be a zombie last year to go trick-or-treating, but my mom just drew some rubbish stitches on my neck and eyeliner and bought some Tesco zombie kit, so it was nowhere near as good as yours,"
I said admiringly, and the kid just laughed. While we'd been talking, my cousins had begun to seek, and we heard squeals, giggles, and the sounds of running as people rushed to get back to the stump.
"Let's stay here for now,"
I said, my strategy being to wait a while, as our hiding place was so good that my cousins would walk out further into the woods, not expecting us to be so close to base, and we could then run to home. While we watched everyone else tearing into the clearing, pursued by my cousins, we sat tight, waiting and talking in hushed voices until we were the last left. My cousins began to search for us, flashing their torches around, and despite being a good 15 meters away from the clearing, I leaned to one side to be out of any possible torchlight and accidentally brushed against the sweatshirt of the kid next to me. He was soaking wet.
"You must be freezing. Did you get splashed doing apple bobbing?"
I whispered.
"Ask my cousins and they might have a hoodie or something you can change into."
At that moment, my cousin shone his torch at just our height, revealing our darkened hiding spot. And in a second, we had jumped out of the fork and darted in two separate directions. I ran flat out, but my cousins caught me, and we walked together, panting back to the clearing.
"Great hiding place. We didn't think to hide there because you can see it easily in the day. Your friend found it,"
I admitted. I sat down on a log by the tree stump with everyone else who had been standing and sitting around waiting.
"That's everyone,"
someone said.
"Who's going next?"
I looked around for the kid I'd shared a hiding place with, wanting to ask him if he'd been caught too. But he wasn't back at the stump.
"That's not everyone,"
I told the group.
"There's still someone to catch." "Who?" "One of your friends who I hid with." "What was his name?" "Dunno, he was wearing a zombie costume." "No, Ben's back already,"
said one kid. And a tall boy wearing a Frankenstein costume with neon green hairspray stuck his tongue out at me.
"No, not him. A different boy. He was about my age and was dressed as a zombie with really cool freaky makeup."
Everyone looked at me blankly.
"I don't know who you are hiding with, mate, but there's only one zombie at this party and that's Ben. You're the youngest one here anyway."
I pressed the issues for a bit, insisting that we were missing the zombie kid, but was frustrated to see that a few of the older kids were giving me patronizing glances, and I was eager to get on with another game, so I dropped it and didn't think much of the zombie kid for a while. A couple of days passed, and before I knew it, it was my last evening at the farmhouse before going home. I'd had a great time and was sad to leave my cousins since I lived so far away and liked all the noise and company I wasn't used to as an only child. It was a stormy night, and the wind was whipping the sides of the barn house. I had slept in the attic bedroom with my youngest cousin throughout my stay, but since it was my last night, all my cousins brought their duvets upstairs to sit around, eating snacks and telling scary stories, something that had become a tradition during my stay. Usually the scary stories were predictable rip-offs of horror films my cousins had seen, but it was fun all the same. This time, however, my cousins remembered one they hadn't told me.
"Tell him the story about Danny Hopper." "Surely he's heard that one." "No, he wouldn't have heard it. He's not from around here, and we haven't told him." "Let's tell him. The difference between this one and all the others is, this one is true."
So, I sat with rapt attention in the flickering yellow glow of the electric light as my cousin began to tell the story. It was evident that my other cousins had heard this story many times before, and it was some kind of local legend in their small town. It was told expertly in a way which left no doubt that the tale had been told by the light of many flickering torches during the month of October. The story followed a boy that had once lived in the same large, old farmhouse that my cousins now owned. They explained that 20 or so years ago, the little boy had been playing alone in the woods just down the hill from their house. He had tripped and fallen into the murky and deceptively deep lake that was fed into the same stream we had often paddled in. Having been unable to swim and injured from his fall, he had struggled, but eventually drowned in the cold water, nobody having been around to help him. I sat in horrified silence as my cousins continued to depict how his body had to be dredged from the lake after his parents had searched for him for hours. But by the time they found him, he had turned blue in the freezing water.
That happened on Halloween night 23 years ago,
finished my cousin with a satisfied expression at the horror-stricken expression I must have been wearing. My cousins laughed at my extreme reaction to the very tame story compared to many of the others we'd heard. But, of course, I was not shocked into stunned silence by my cousin's storytelling ability, but rather the resounding feeling that my zombie friend had not been wearing a costume. As an adult, I have been to Halloween parties in which we played hide and seek in the woods at midnight. However, it wasn't each other that we were seeking, rather bottles of alcohol that the wonderful party host had hidden before the guests arrived. The only spirits that found us that night were those out of the bottle. Until next time, stay out of the woods. But if you can't, and you see a blue boy hiding in a tree fork, be kind to him and offer him some of your candy.
From childhood's hour, I have not been. As others were, I have not seen. As others saw, I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken. My sorrow I could not awaken. My heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill, the mystery which binds me still. From the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view.
Good evening, Halloweenies, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. We certainly have our share of pumpkin patch stories this month, don't we? Tonight, we bring you another. This one is quite different from the previous, though, as I'm sure you will agree. We now present the aptly titled Pumpkin Patch. The town I grew up in would be considered a bit country, to say the least. There were tons of farms, cornfields, and lots of churches. You know the type of place. It had many downsides for sure, but the most annoying thing to me was the fact that the town had essentially banned Halloween. They apparently saw it as the devil's holiday, so we weren't allowed to put any decorations out. No costumes, and there were definitely no pumpkins. In fact, pumpkin farming was practically illegal in our town just because of the association with Halloween. I used to think this severe outlook was based on the area's strong religious influence, but it turns out there was much more to the story than I ever knew. As a youngster, I was always intrigued by Halloween. I constantly asked adults about what the holiday was like and why we didn't celebrate it, to which they always responded with nervous silence or a change of subject. Halloween was like a bad word in my hometown. Then last year, an old man, who was said to be the town's oldest resident, was asked to come to our school and speak to the students about the history of the town. He had literally lived there since World War I and was one of the last surviving people in general from that era. During his speech, he would lose his train of thought repeatedly and just gaze out at the audience with those piercing light blue eyes. It may have just been nerves from the large crowd, but I felt something was off about him. No one else seemed to notice, though. The teachers eventually opened up the floor for questions from the audience. All the other kids asked him things like, what did the first TV look like? And how did you ever live without GPS? My question was very different, and I think I caught him off guard. I simply asked the question why our town was so afraid of Halloween, He froze up on stage for a moment, and his eyes widened as the room went silent. A teacher angrily approached me and took the microphone away, stating that Halloween wasn't appropriate to be talking about at school. I was pretty annoyed at being censored, but it seemed like most of the adults in the audience were on the teacher's side, so I walked back to my chair, defeated. Our principal stepped out onto the stage and announced that we were out of time and began to guide the old man away. His whole way off the stage, though, he just kept looking back at me. The principal approached me in the hall afterward and said that if I ever brought up Halloween in school again like that, I would surely be suspended. Before I could even respond, the school bell rang and kids began darting off in different directions. I had to go turn in an assignment before I left, so by the time I got out to the front of campus, pretty much everyone was already gone. I headed over to the bike rack to start riding home when the old man from the stage approached me from around the side of the building. He clutched my shirt, trying to tell me something, but before he could get it out, 2 teachers came and grabbed him from behind. They began to guide him away toward a van, but before he left, he was able to mutter 2 ominous words: pumpkin patch. Not having any idea what he meant by pumpkin patch, I started doing research on what he could have been talking about. There wasn't much information about it on the internet, so I went to the local library and started digging through old newspaper articles. I looked for stories about pumpkin patches on Halloween or anything related to that, but found nothing. However, I did come across a story about the old man who had visited my school. Apparently, his younger brother had gone missing when he was a child, and despite the search efforts of the townspeople, he was never found. While it was sad, the story didn't seem to lead me anywhere at first, until I dug a little deeper into the incident itself. It turns out the last place his brother had been seen before disappearing was around a place called Willow Farms on the far end of town. I started to wonder if there was a pumpkin patch at that farm, and decided to ride my bike over the next day to check it out. It was an old, kind of run-down place with these weeping willows growing everywhere across the property. I strolled onto the farm acting like I was looking to buy fresh vegetables. A jockish teenage farm boy sat up on the porch with a shotgun at his side, barely even acknowledging me. He actually seemed like he was going in and out of sleep, which enabled me to sneak off and look around the rest of the farm. After about 45 minutes of not finding any pumpkins, I started getting frustrated and decided to head home. It was dark at that point, and the farm shined with the glare from a full moon above. I hopped on my bike and started riding, and was nearly off the property when I witnessed in the distance the teen dragging a burlap sack and shovel out into the woods behind the farm. I hastily abandoned my bike in the bushes and started following him from a distance. I crept past the tree line and continued to watch as the farm boy pulled the sack further and further out into the woods. He eventually disappeared into a cluster of trees through an old iron gate and into a wooded fenced-in area. Making my way around the side of it, I peered over the fence through the trees. The little area was filled with these rows of pumpkins. They were strange looking, too. Large, deformed, and almost seeming as if they were bursting out from the dirt. The farm boy laid the bag down and began digging aggressively into an empty plot at the end of one of the rows. He kept looking down at his watch constantly, and then up at the full moon. Finally, the hole was big enough to fit the sack inside, and he started dragging it in. The sound of a twig snapping came from the other end of the clearing. The farm boy looked up and saw a decrepit old man with overalls and a long gray beard standing just beyond the pumpkins. He was hunched all the way over, and his face had an unsettling look of hollow joy. The thing that really stood out to me about him was his eyes, though. They were the same piercing light blue that the old man talking at my school had.
I'm sorry, I lost track of time,
the farm boy said in a fearful voice. The man didn't respond. He just stared ominously as he began slowly approaching the hole. The farm boy quickly tossed the sack inside and started running. The old man approached the bag, running his fingers along the tops of the pumpkins as he hobbled toward it. In a strange, unexpected burst of energy, he grabbed the bulging piece from one of the pumpkins and tore it off, voraciously biting into it. The man then leaned down and pulled up the top of the bag, untying it and checking inside. Pleased, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of powder and beginning to draw a circle in the dirt around the hole. He then drew out these strange symbols in front of it and pulled out a knife from his back pocket. Then he sliced his hand and dripped the blood all along the top of the bag, causing steam to slowly rise. It began to jolt around as if someone was inside and struggling. All I could do was cover my mouth and try not to breathe too loud. After a few moments, the bag stopped moving and the man looked up at the sky, letting out this unbelievably demonic roar. He then turned and left through the trees the same way he'd come. Once I was sure he had left, I crept through the gate and went in to check inside the bag. I pulled it open and witnessed to my horror the body of a young girl named Kaylee McDonald, who had gone missing from my school a few weeks earlier. She didn't appear to be breathing, and her skin was covered with these strange orange lesions, almost appearing like the outer skin of a pumpkin. As I gazed around at the rest of the clearing, I began to realize what should have been obvious all along. All of the pumpkins in that pumpkin patch resembled the shape of humans, each with bulges where arms and legs and a head would be. I was then startled by the sound of a shotgun cocking behind me. I turned back and saw the farm boy aiming his shotgun right at my chest.
Did it see you?
He whispered sternly. I shook my head no, and he sighed with relief, dropping his shovel to the side.
You don't know how lucky you are,
he said as he signaled for me to start walking. He followed me out of the woods and back toward my bike at the front of the property. I'm assuming that must be how he found out that I was here. With his shotgun still aimed at me, he signaled to leave, but said that if I ever talked about this to anyone, that he would be the least of my worries. Terrified, I thanked him and rode off. After weeks of trying to keep it a secret, though, I couldn't last any longer. I told my parents about it, who informed the police. They told us they would investigate it, but that we should keep quiet for our safety. The problem was, months went by, and that investigation never happened. Then, one day, we saw Kelly McDonald's mom at the grocery store. She looked like an empty shell of a person, a woman with no reason to go on. That was my breaking point. I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Whatever secret the town was protecting, it wasn't worse than this. That was when I decided to make this story. I still want to keep my identity secret, and I don't want to release any more details until I know I can guarantee my family's safety. Even though now That seems like it may be more difficult to accomplish than I thought. This morning there was a knock at my door, and something horrific was left on the steps outside. It was a pumpkin resembling the terrified face of the farm boy, with the words, "You're next," carved into the side. I've decided that from now on, I will not be going to any pumpkin patches. Until next time, avoid any pumpkins that seem to look like humans.
Greenest of our valleys, by good angels tenanted, once a fair and stately palace, radiant palace, reared its head. In the monarch thought's dominion, it stood there. Never seraph spread a pinion over fabric half so fair. Banners yellow, glorious golden, on its roof did float and flow. This, all this, was in the olden time long ago. And every gentle air that dallied in that sweet day, along the ramparts plumed and pallid, a winged odor went away. Wanderers in that happy valley through two luminous windows saw spirits moving musically to a lute's well-tuned law. Round about a throne where sitting Porphyrogene, in state his glory well befitting, the ruler of the realm was seen, and all with pearl and ruby glowing was the fair palace door, through which came flowing, and sparkling evermore, a troop of echoes whose sweet duty was but to sing, in voices of surpassing beauty, the wit and wisdom of their king. But evil things in robes of sorrow assailed the monarch's high estate. Ah, let us mourn, for never morrow shall dawn upon him desolate. And round about his home the glory that blushed and bloomed is but a dim remembered story of the old time entombed. And travelers now within that valley through the red-litten windows see vast forms that move fantastically to a discordant melody, while like a ghastly rapid river through the pale door, a hideous throng rush out forever and laugh but smile no more.
Without flashing lights,
Good evening, and welcome to the Phantasmagorium. I am your host, the Creeper of Channel X. We are now just a few short days away from Halloween, and the ghost sightings seem to be getting more prevalent. Have you seen one? In tonight's tale, we explore what happens when a place that doesn't normally celebrate Halloween decides to start. Put on your headphones, turn out the lights, and enjoy a spooky little piece called Along Came Halloween. As far as I know, most people in Africa are not familiar with Halloween. I once explained to an ex-girlfriend of mine that it's a time of year when people celebrate ghosts, and she almost slapped the black off of my skin because she thought I was screwing with her. In retrospect, I didn't properly explain the creepy holiday. Anyway, the point is, most of my friends, family, relatives, and associates don't know about Halloween. I'm from a country in southern Africa, and I have to be honest, Halloween is not a big deal here. I'm not going to disclose my name or that of my country, because some of the stuff in this story is illegal, and I don't fancy spending time in the big house again. I only know about Halloween because of the many European and American horror movies I watch. Not to mention, I'm a devoted patron of internet sites like Reddit and Creepypasta. Even with my knowledge of it, I was never big on Halloween. That all changed last year when certain circumstances led me to move back in with my parents. Let me first explain how this 35-year-old man ended up staying with his parents again. I was never formally employed. I did several shady deals around town which provided for my bread and butter. I was what most people would refer to as a scammer or con man or con artist. Before you judge me, you should know that this wasn't my dream profession when I was a kid. My country's economy is not that good, and decent jobs are hard to come by. Anyway, one day, a deal went bad, and it cost me my house, furniture, and cars. This forced me back to my parents' home. I am not married and don't have any kids that I know of. So my parents didn't complain too much because I wasn't bringing extra mouths to feed. One night in early October of last year, I was binge reading stories on the internet, and I realized most of them were centered on Halloween. That's when it dawned on me we were close to the spooky holiday. A light bulb turned on in my head, and dollar signs rolled up in front of my eyes. I had an idea. This idea was going to get me paid big time. I could feel it. I had to create a haunted house. I had the perfect house in mind. The house next door had been vacant for years. When I was growing up, different families moved into the house but never stayed for longer than a year. I never thought much about it, and I figured it was because of the rent or the bills. My parents live in an opulent suburban neighborhood, and most people can't handle the costs of staying in that area. I knew the real estate agency which owns the house had security guards that watched over the place. I knew one of the guards. His name was George. He had dark skin, he was thin as a rack, bald as a coot, and he had a mustache thick enough to put Super Mario to shame. Whenever I got the chance, I always chatted with him for a few hours. He would pour his heart out to me. He would talk about his wife, his family, his job, his boss, and a bunch of other things I never cared to know about. I wasn't sure if he considered me a friend, and I wanted to use this situation to gauge the nature of our relationship. I approached George with the proposal of using the house as a haunted attraction for a few hours during his shift, and he was hesitant at first. However, as someone who had whined to me about his measly salary, he agreed after I convinced him that this could be an opportunity for him to make some money on the side. He vehemently warned me that if he lost his job because of this, he would have my head. Since his job was usually as boring as watching paint dry, he also offered to help me with running the haunted house, and this was music to my ears. I just needed one more person for assistance, and John happened to be that guy. John is a thick-set man who has always had the same crew-cut hairstyle ever since I met him back in high school. I know I said he is thick-set, but if you say that to his face, he may drop you with a punch. He prefers to be called big-boned. John is a huge baby. He also lived with his parents, but he had a well-paying job as a baker at a local supermarket. He earned enough money to fend for himself, but I guess he still wanted his mother to do his laundry and his dad to check for monsters under his bed, which is why he's still residing at his childhood home. Anyway, John was also on board with helping out with the haunted house, and he even made posters to advertise the place. He put them up all over the neighborhood. He also brought discarded cookies and muffins from the bakery, which he suggested we could give to our customers after they've gone through the haunted house. I loved the idea because it really captured the Halloween concept of trick or treat, even though we were actually giving both a trick and a treat to our customers. It also meant we will be charging the customers more, so I gave a double thumbs up to the idea. Next, I needed props to decorate the house. Since I was dead broke, I had to work with what was at my disposal. My mother has a lot of bed sheets which I borrowed without her knowledge. My younger sister, Ruth, was a hoarder of dolls when she was a child, but she neglected all her toys when she reached puberty. My dad kept all of Ruth's dolls in the garage. I also borrowed several of these dolls without telling anyone about it. So when I finally had my props and team, I felt confident this haunted house scheme would be a success. When we went to the house to set up for the first time, I was shocked with the deplorable state of the place. I had never gone inside our neighboring house before. Every time I spoke with George, it was always outside the gate. The yard was choked up with waist-high brown grass. The windows were caked with dust. The 7-foot-tall Dura wall was mantled with green vines. And the wrought iron front gate had enough rust to give you tetanus by just looking at it. The house was a typical suburban home painted white with a sloping blue roof. It had 3 bedrooms, a toilet, a kitchen, a lounge, and a dining room. The little bit of furniture it had was decrepit and filled with either dust or cobwebs. The place was already creepy and required minimum effort on our behalf. George told us the house has an electrical problem, so it didn't have power. His bosses had sworn to get the problem fixed, but they hadn't done anything about it yet. We didn't mind because the lack of power served our purpose well. It took us half a day to set up everything we needed. Our target audience were kids preferably below 13, and since they weren't that hard to scare, we didn't have to go full psycho on the decorations. The rundown of the haunted house was simple. As soon as our customers arrive, the front gate will appear to have swung open by itself, but in reality, it was being pulled open by George using a wire. He would be hiding deep in the thicket of brown grass in the yard. The customers would be met by a small wooden table with a glass jar on top, labeled "Feed Me," where they will pay their admission fee. If they pay, George was supposed to play a recording of witches laughing from his phone. If they didn't pay, George was supposed to play a recording of barking dogs. John and I would be inside the house. If we heard the sound of laughing witches from George's phone, we would get into our positions. If we heard the sound of barking dogs, it meant the approaching customers hadn't paid, so we would lock the front door. We were not going to entertain broke kids. This was a business, an illegal one, sure, but a business nonetheless. Anyway, after payment, the customers would follow the concrete pavement leading up to the front door. The pavement was smeared with ketchup, which I also borrowed from home without telling anyone. My mother became suspicious of how the ketchup was finishing up so quickly, and since my father really loved the stuff, she considered him the biggest culprit. I kept my mouth zipped. The walkway was flanked with tall brown grass where we planted doll heads on sticks. The customers would walk down the pavement and enter through the front door, which led to a spacious lounge where dead lizards hanging on strings will dangle down from the ceiling. George provided us with the dead lizards. I have no idea why he had them or where he got them, and frankly, I didn't want to know. The loud wailing of a baby will then arrest the attention of the customers, and they would follow the crying to a closet in one of the rooms. Before they reached the closet, a doll would pop out holding a butcher knife, and it's meant to chase the customers out of the room. John would be in the closet playing a recording of a crying baby on his phone. He would also be the one pulling strings for the doll to walk and make threatening gestures with its arms. This particular doll was spine-tingling to look at, even for me. I have no idea why my sister kept this thing as a child. It looked like a Chucky understudy because of its shiny porcelain skin, the nefarious smile on its scarred face, and its long, bedraggled orange hair. The customers will then proceed to the main bedroom where I will be. We called this room the White Room. The room's furniture only comprised of a small rickety table, a wooden rocking chair, and a large fitted-in bookshelf. All of this furniture would be shrouded with white bed sheets. I would also be cloaked by a white bed sheet and standing next to the bookshelf waiting for the customers to enter. The bed sheet I often used was long enough to cover my whole body, including my feet. I was always concerned that one day I would trip over myself and not only fall, but shamefully reveal myself to the customers. Thankfully, it never happened. When the customers entered my room, I was supposed to run at them and chase them out of the house. When they reached the gate, they would find the admission fee jar gone, and in its place, there would be a plate with either a muffin or a cookie. Not a bad haunted house for guys with a $0 budget, huh? Business boomed in the first week. John marketed our haunted house well. His posters were quite alluring. I had warned him to only advertise in our neighborhood. We didn't want George's bosses finding out about this and getting us arrested. John even spread rumors that the old inhabitants of the house were Satanists who used to sacrifice children for fortune and fame. The news spread like wildfire and brought us a lot of customers. Since our suburban neighborhood was extremely boring, people were always eager to jump at anything that entertains them. At first, mostly young kids were our biggest customers, but eventually, teenagers and adults also took an interest in our haunted house. George's shift usually started late afternoon, and John finished work at midday, so we would open the haunted house at 4 o'clock and closed it around 7 p.m. For 2 amazing weeks, we made great money, which we split 3 ways. I was having the time of my life, and I was thinking of milking this cow until it runs dry. I wanted to run this business until the end of the year. However, one fateful night forced us to retire early from this dream job we didn't know we wanted. It was 2 days before Halloween, and it was almost closing time. It was already dark, and we had agreed to do one more act before we called it a day. I heard girls giggling from the hallway, and a guy's voice said, "Oh my, that is scary." The sarcasm in his deep voice was all too evident. The group of customers continued cackling as they made their way to my room. I heard one of them complaining of how this was a waste of money. They reached my room and stood by the door. The bedsheet festooning me was pure silk, so I was able to see through it. The glimmer of the moon spilling through the barren windows was enough for me to confirm what I already suspected. It was a group of teenagers. Teenagers were problematic for a lot of reasons. Most of the time they didn't want to pay, they were barely scared with our stunts, and some of them thought it was best to write on the walls, steal, or break something in the house before they left. The group was comprised of 2 girls and 1 guy. One of the girls had dark skin, short hair, and hazel brown eyes. The other girl had long black braids tied into a ponytail, light skin, and dark brown eyes. They were both wearing white jean shorts and were garbed by a pink and red tank top respectively. The guy accompanying them was a well-built kid with thick black afro hair. He wore skinny blue jeans and a gray t-shirt.
"What's going on in here?"
the guy asked as the trio walked into the room. The girls snickered as they swaggered close to each other.
"That's really innovative, dude. We can see you under that bedsheet,"
the guy said. I sighed for being made out so easily, but I then realized that the teenager wasn't talking to or looking at me. He was looking to the opposite side of where I was standing. In fact, all three of them were looking in that direction. I followed their gaze, and my heart stopped. A few feet to my right, there was someone seated on the rocking chair in the room. The figure had a white bedsheet blanketing its humanoid body. My mind raced to think of who it could be. I considered the possibility of George or John coming into my act. The figure slowly stood up from the rocking chair, and the sound of snapping and crackling bones resonated from underneath the bedsheet. The humanoid figure stood at a colossal height. It was about 8 feet tall and slim like a willow. Its shoes were sticking out from under the bedsheet. Its feet were facing sideways like how Charlie Chaplin used to stand. And just like Charlie Chaplin, its shoe size was ridiculously long. The shiny black leather shoes of the figure looked like the shoes of a cartoon clown. All of a sudden, the figure began marching toward the teenagers. With every step it took, its Bugs Bunny-sized shoes pounded on the hardwood floor with force. The teenage girls wrapped their arms around each other and shuffled behind the boy.
"Hey man, we get it. You're a ghost. You scared the girls, but now you need to stop,"
said the teenage boy. Like a bouncer walking up to someone causing problems in the club, the figure's striding had a malicious intent to it. Its giant steps were rapidly decreasing the distance between it and the teenagers.
"Okay, that's far enough, pal. Don't come any closer. I'm warning you. I have got skills of combat,"
the boy yelled at the figure. But the figure was already upon them. The teenage boy swung a punch at the bedsheet, and it flapped to the ground, revealing no one underneath it. The leather shoes that rivaled the size of a duck's feet had also disappeared. My knees wiggled, and a wave of uneasiness jounced my scrawny body as I stared at the bedsheet lying flat on the ground. The teenagers' voices were all blanched with fear. The vanity of the girls had disappeared, and the bravado of the boy had evaporated. They all screamed so loudly they didn't realize I was also screaming with them. I began running toward the door, and the teenagers noticed me. They probably thought I was another apparition coming after them, and they bolted out of the room. They ran down the hallway and went out the front door with lightning speed. Before I exited the white room, I was dumb enough to turn back, and my heart jumped to my throat at what I saw. The bony humanoid figure was erecting from below the bedsheet. It stood once more at an abnormal height, and its inhumanly long shoes had reappeared. I yanked my bedsheet to the floor and ran like the wind. I sped down the hallway and burst out the front door. I screamed for help from John or George, and I think I even yelled out for my mother in the process. George stopped me before I ran out of the gate, and he asked me what was wrong. I was too petrified to reply, so I just pointed at the house. John came wobbling out of the house and asked the same question as George. After a couple of deep breaths, I tried to explain, but I was interrupted by a sound emanating from the house. It was the sound of a crying baby.
"Did you leave your phone inside the house?"
I asked John. His reply shook my body to the core.
"No, I have it with me."
He even showed it to me. The sound of the crying baby became louder. It soon seemed like there was a crying baby in every room of the house.
What is happening?
George tremulously asked. No one replied to him because we had all noticed a cadaverous figure covered with a white bedsheet was by the door. Its protracted shoes were now hovering in the air as the figure floated a few inches above the ground. The sounds of crying children had reached ear-shredding volumes. Some of the crying seemed to be coming from the doll heads on sticks in the yard. My stomach was in knots when I noticed the gobs of worms pouring out of the doll heads' mouths and ears. The figure by the door stretched out its arms like Jesus on the cross, and one by one, the lights of each room in the house switched on. My mouth was dry and agape when I saw the dead lizards hanging down from the ceiling of every room in the house.
I don't remember putting up all those lizards,
I heard George mutter. The figure eventually lowered its arms, and all the lights simultaneously switched off. The front door abruptly slammed shut in front of the figure, and the crying ceased. That night, George stayed at our house. I forgot the explanation I gave my parents, but I guess it was more believable than the truth. Up until now, I had never spoken to anyone else beside George and John about that night. I tried convincing both of them that it was a prank of some sort, but even I couldn't believe that. George quit his job the very next day. He used the money he made from the haunted house to open a tuck shop or a barber shop or something. I told you he made good money. John also quit his job and became a paranormal investigator. He goes around the country exploring and researching ghosts and haunted places. His team once went into the house next door with cameras and a bunch of ghost-busting equipment, but I never asked what they found. I had already seen enough. I soon moved out of my parents' house. I couldn't stand the sound of a crying baby I always heard coming from next door in the middle of the night. I now have my own apartment on the east side of the country. I am not an expert on Halloween, but I have a feeling it had something to do with whatever spirit that came after us that night. I once asked George if something like that had previously happened at the house, and he said no. He had even asked the other guards, and they said they never experienced anything of the sort during their shifts. My reasoning is this. By celebrating Halloween, we may have invited or awoken something supernatural in that house. I know that sounds crazy, but John contacted me the other day, and he said, according to his nationwide research, more people in the country are celebrating Halloween this year, and based on the statistics, this year now has the most ghost sightings in the country's history. When introducing a custom such as Halloween to a place which has of it no prior knowledge, one must be careful so as not to bring the dark side with it. Until next time, sweet nightmares.
It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea. this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea. But we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee. With a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that, long ago, in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know, in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we. And neither the angels in heaven above, nor the demons down under the sea, can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And the stars never rise, but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so, all the night tide, I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my pride, in her sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea.
Welcome, friends, and thank you for coming to the show. Please have your tickets ready as we come through to check them. Tonight, I will be your host. You can call me the Creeper. Welcome to the show, Carnival X. For your enjoyment, we have 4 fun-sized tales of Halloween terror, all of them involving strange and even horrific encounters that occurred while trick-or-treating. Please step into our first tent. In here, we will hear our shortest tale first, which involves a very strange trick-or-treating experience in which the children never received their treats. Put your headphones on, turn out the lights, and enjoy our first story, titled Spooky Halloween Encounter.
When I was a kid, about 10, I was allowed to go trick-or-treating alone around the neighborhood with 2 friends, both my age. I was dressed as a witch, or something of that nature. It was a long time ago, so I don't quite remember. Anyway, we get to a house where a man, who is probably in his mid-40s, answers the door and says that the candy is inside, and we can step in and get it. Being up to date on our stranger danger lectures, we politely declined and offered to wait outside. He looked annoyed, but didn't press it. He said to wait right there and then shut the door. Maybe 30 seconds pass, and then he flings the door open. There's a flash as he takes a picture of us and slams the door in our face. We all ran down to the main street and stood for a second, wondering what happened, and then decided just to keep trick-or-treating. Luckily, nothing happened, but it scared the heck out of us.
Now, there's a house where I definitely would not want to be asking for treats. What was that man doing with the photos of those children anyway? Perhaps we'll hear from him again later, but hopefully not. If you step this way into our second tent, we will experience our second unwanted encounter of the night. But this time, instead of a creepy homeowner, we come across someone who claims to be protecting children from a creepy homeowner. Perhaps these were both from the same house? Nevertheless, please enjoy the simply titled Fake Cop on Halloween.
This happened almost a decade ago when I was 13 years old. I remember my friend and I were excited about our first time trick-or-treating without our parents. We lived in a small town where nothing ever happens, and we thought it would be the same that night. It started like any other Halloween night. We collected candy, ran into many of our classmates, and had a lot of fun. At 8 p.m., we realized we had to head home, but on the way back, we dropped by our teacher's house. She wasn't home, and the street didn't have many streetlights. To add to this, most of the houses had their lights turned off, and their Halloween decorations were taken down. My friend and I were slightly spooked and disappointed by the lack of candy. We wanted to get out of the street as soon as possible. That's when a man emerged from under one of the few streetlights. It was a police officer. Neither of us seemed to notice him before this, possibly due to the darkness. He startled us, but seemed very friendly. The cop introduced himself and pointed to an inconspicuous bungalow. He said an older man living in this house was inviting trick-or-treaters inside. Someone called the police, but when he arrived, no one was answering the door. He kept telling us his police car and partner were just around the block. We looked around, but couldn't see them. I was a pretty paranoid kid. Growing up, my mom loved watching crime shows, and she'd always tell me tidbits of lessons. One of these was a story about fake cops. Although I don't remember the details, I remembered people can pretend to be police officers to gain trust. Throughout this whole exchange, I was terrified. His lack of badge, police car, and partner did not feel right. I was also conflicted because he was smiling and seemed like he just wanted to help. That was, until we heard his strange request. He said he needed to speak to this potential predator and needed our help. Since we were young girls, the man would answer if we knocked. The officer claimed he would hide behind the bushes next to the front door. He would wait for him to invite us in, jump out, and catch him red-handed. At that moment, I knew my friend felt the same way I did. We both fell silent, but one of us managed to ask if we could discuss. The cop said yes, but told us we had limited time. The street was silent, and he could hear everything. I remember the feeling of wanting to say something, but fearing he would hear us and escalate the situation. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever. The cop was getting increasingly impatient and told us we had to decide quickly. Around that moment, a family came down the street and noticed the officer. They were coming over to see what was happening. That's when the cop said he'd be right back and to not go anywhere. My friend and I scrambled to collect our thoughts and decided to run away. We sprinted out of the street and didn't look back. On our way home, we discussed theories that ranged from him being a fake cop, him playing a prank on us, or him being a real cop, but we misunderstood the situation. When we told our parents, we downplayed it a lot and doubted our experience. In the end, we didn't call the police, but our dads drove to the house and area around the house. No cop cars or police officers were in sight. Over the years, I can say I regret not calling the police. At the time, my friend and I were convinced we misunderstood what happened. We even told our class the next day, and most, including our teacher, thought it was not alarming. Looking back, I find it extremely strange a police officer would put two children in such a potentially dangerous situation, moreover with our parents not present. I wonder what his motives were. But it will, unfortunately, remain unsolved.
These kids just can't catch a break, can they? First it's the creepy homeowners, then it's the creepy fake police officer claiming to be protecting them from the other creep. Please follow me to the next tent. For our next tale, our trick-or-treaters dare to approach a home with a very long driveway, from which they cannot even see the house at the end. Please enjoy The House with the Long Driveway. When I was 2, my family moved from rural Louisiana to a suburb in the city. Growing up, I would play with the neighborhood kids. We would ride scooters and bikes up and down the street, or we would play hide and seek.
They were the type of kids who were too cool for baby things like cartoons and feelings. For the most part, the neighbors were okay. We had our share of those who would yell at us for being on their lawn, but for the most part, everyone kept to themselves. All of the houses were the same basic model. They all had grass lawns with 2 bushes in front and a privacy fence in the backyard. However, there was one house that was very strange. Unlike the cookie-cutter suburban homes, this house was built on a dip in the surrounding land away from the rest of the houses. It had a pond next to it, with a small bridge over it that served as the driveway, which led up to a large black gate with stone pillars decorated with lanterns. The yard was scattered with trees that provided shade and made the house look very dark, even in the day. There were always cars in the driveway, but I never saw anyone there. Nobody did. There was never any spooky event or time that caused everyone to be afraid of the house that I knew of. The house just seemed to give off an aura. Nobody wanted to go near it. All the kids would use the buddy system just to walk past it. Every once in a while, kids would be dared to do things like touch the gates or just stand by them alone for a few minutes. Some cocky kids would even climb onto the pillars to be cool. The biggest dare, however, was to go get candy from them on Halloween. Only the brave kids would attempt this. According to some of these kids, every Halloween, the gates would be opened, decorations would line the driveway, and, if you were brave enough, a bowl of premium candy would be at the end. Full bars of Hershey, Nutter Butter, full-sized Reese's. Of course, it was always okay to go in groups of 3 or more. Kid logic, you know. There would be loud Halloween music and treats, but no people. At some point, almost everyone was dared. The full-size bars were just too tempting. Besides, we didn't think anything bad really happened at that house. It was just creepy. When I was 11, it happened to me. I was dared to trick or treat at their house. I guess it was because I was a huge scaredy cat, and the other kids could sense that. When you're 11, you can't be scared, so I agreed. I guess they felt a little bad for me, so I was allowed to bring one person with me. I chose Jordan. She was my next-door neighbor, kinda pudgy and very insecure about it. We were both considered lame, so we tended to stick together. She was a huge crybaby. The other kids liked to pick on her because they would always get a reaction. She was also extremely empathetic. No matter how much she got, she would always talk about how the other kids are probably mean because they're hurting. She always said one day they would change. When the night came, the kids gathered by the house. Jordan and I were given the rundown. They would wait 3 minutes by the gate. If we didn't show after that, they would leave us. We were handed 2 trash bags for candy and sent on our way. They said they would watch us to make sure we didn't chicken out, but if we took too long, they would just leave so they could trick or treat. Halfway down the driveway, we started to get creeped out. I decided to look back and make sure they were still there. I couldn't see them anymore. Trees were blocking our view. Jordan tapped me and said we should hurry before they leave. The farther we walked, the louder the music seemed. It was fun, jaunty Halloween music mixed with atmospheric noises like doors creaking, Wilhelm screams, and basic spooky moans. When we got down to the front porch, we decided to rock, paper, scissors for who would actually grab the candy. I won. I stood guard while Jordan crept up to the door and grabbed a handful of Nutter Butters. The moment she dug her hand in, a piercing scream rung out. Both me and Jordan jumped back. She slipped on the porch and fell hard. I rushed to try and help her up. I asked her if she was okay. She started tearing up. She had some cuts on her arms that were bleeding. I was trying to dust her off when the front door creaked open. A lady appeared. She told us that she heard a thump and decided to check up on us. It gave me a very uneasy vibe. She looked stiff, like a mannequin. It was hard to notice anything else though, because I found myself staring at her eyes. There was something hypnotic about it. She told us that she would get a first aid kit inside, and that we should follow her. As her figure started to slink back into the darkness, both me and Jordan found ourselves standing up. I was too focused on her eyes to figure out what was going on. Her brown, amber eyes seemed bright, almost like they were glowing. I almost stepped inside the house, but my shoe clipped the door frame, causing me to stumble, and I snapped out of it. In a split second, I realized her feet weren't touching the ground. She didn't even look like a person, just vaguely person-shaped. Her eyes were just two glowing holes. Jordan was already in the house. I reached out to try and grab her, but the lady wrapped her arms and legs around her, and in a split second, both of them were snapped backward into the darkness. In that moment, the lady seemed to resemble a Venus flytrap-like being. The front door slammed shut, and there was a piercing scream. Before I fully realized what happened, I ran back to the front gate. Nobody was waiting for us. I stood there in shock for about an hour. I was shaking and sweaty, felt like I was going to throw up. A concerned mother approached me and asked if everything was okay. I just nodded and said I was going to go find my friends. When I tracked most of them down, they expressed that they waited for us for 10 minutes but got bored. I tried to tell them, but they all laughed at me and told me my ghost story wasn't very scary. After that night, Jordan was reported missing. Everyone assumed she was kidnapped on Halloween, and that my mind made up a ghost tale to try and deal with the trauma. A while passed, and people started forgetting about Jordan. Even her parents started forgetting important details. Soon, I began to wonder how many kids everyone just forgot. Some days, I passed the house. Some days, the doors open. It always seems like there's a light somewhere inside, calling me. Jordan, I'm so sorry.
least in the first two stories, our heroes made the escape. Unfortunately, Jordan was not so lucky. If you will follow me to our fourth tent, we will hear the longest of our 4 fun-sized tales of the evening. In our first 3 tales, our protagonists were all innocent. However, in our final tale, I think you may find that our heroes may just be responsible for their own fate. This one is called Breaking into Merv the Perv's house on Halloween was a mistake. Now, I'd think breaking into a house of someone named Merv the Perv would be a mistake on any day. Anyway, roll the story. You're still coming to Merv the Perv's house tonight, right?
Jack asked, slouching over the handlebars of his push bike.
Noah's been keeping the eggs under his bed for weeks. He said the smell is getting pretty bad. Maybe,
I replied.
I have to take Will trick-or-treating first. You better not be bitching out.
Jack frowned.
I'm not bitching out,
I lied. Vigilante justice just wasn't in my nature, but unfortunately giving in to peer pressure was.
My old man caught him going through our trash yesterday. Reckons he was willing to leave it alone when it was just the photos of our houses, but now Dad said we ought to teach him a lesson. I think most of the street feels that way. I'll meet up with you guys after, okay? Alright, meet us outside Noah's house,
Jack said before riding off. Merv had become the pariah of our quiet street since moving in over a year ago. At first, it was just pictures of our houses with Merv claiming it was for historical purposes. Tensions rose when he started taking photos of the street's occupants. You could be taking the trash out or mowing the lawn, and Merv would walk out onto his porch and snap a photo. Things reached a boiling point when he was caught rummaging through the garbage bins on collection day. Messing with Merv was a regular occurrence now that the kids on our cul-de-sac knew it would result in little to no punishment from their parents. It was never anything serious. A few flat tires or less than desirable words exchanged on sight. Halloween was just another excuse to make his life harder. After my little brother Will had dragged me up and down the neighborhood, I took him home and met up with Jack and Noah. Merv's house was only a few doors down on the opposite side of the street. Slowing our pace, we waited for those still roaming the streets in search of candy to go home before hiding behind the large oak tree in Merv's front yard. It came as no surprise there weren't any decorations nor any children approaching his door. Noah opened his backpack, and the smell of the eggs made me gag.
Yeah,
Noah laughed.
Try sleeping with them under your bed.
I don't think I'll ever eat eggs again.
Shh, shut up,
Jack ordered in a hushed tone and pointed. Look, over there. Merv's garage door had opened, and we clung to the side of the oak tree as he reversed down the driveway and pulled out onto the street. Without saying a word, Jack ran toward the garage door as it clunked and creaked shut. Noah and I stumbled to our feet and followed. All 3 of us were able to squeeze through the gap before the garage door shut. It was too dark to see anything, and the smell of eggs mixed with the scent of wood.
You idiot,
I yelled, my heart racing with the fear of what Merv would do to us if we were caught.
Let's just take a look around,
Jack said.
We'll be quick.
Suddenly, a loud crash came from somewhere in the darkness, causing Jack and me to jump out of our skin.
Sorry,
Noah called.
I found the lights.
The bulb came to life and light filled the room. Woodworking equipment hung in every free space of the walls. Hand saws, power saws, planes, and sanders. Entering the house, we found the inside littered with trash, empty bottles, and containers.
What the?
Jack muttered, turning into the living room.
Take a look at this.
3 levels of shelving had been fixed around the entire room, holding dozens of small wooden dolls. They all had different clothing, skin tones, and facial expressions.
Guys,
Noah called from another room.
hurry.
Stepping over the trash and toward Noah's voice, we found him in the dining room past the kitchen. Next to him was a large table stretched from one end of the room to the other. Small wooden houses lay atop the table. At first, I was curious, but as I got closer, chill ran down my spine. Pictures had been taped to every space on the wall. Photos of our houses and families were wrinkled and looked well used.
This is our street,
Noah said, the tone in his voice soft. I looked down to find that Noah was right. Our houses sat in their correct places on the street, in perfect detail. Walking around the table, I knelt down and looked into the front window of my house. Small wooden replica figures of my parents sat on the couch in the living room, staring at the tiny wooden TV.
He's made figures for my parents,
I said.
Dude,
Jack shouted.
The doll even has the same shirt my mom was wearing today. I can't find myself. Am I at either of your houses?
Noah asked. Realizing I hadn't seen my own doll, I looked back down and, to my horror, saw the doll of my mother start to move its limbs. In jarring, slow motions, it walked toward the window and closed the curtain.
It moved,
I said in a panic.
It moved. The figure moved. Stop messing with us,
Noah spat.
This place is scary enough. He's not lying, Noah,
Jack mumbled.
Look at this.
Jack pointed to the replica of Merv's house, and we peered through the side window. There, in Merv's dining room, our 3 counterparts stood around the table. Noah's face went pale as he stared at the dolls.
I'm getting out of here,
I said, turning toward the door. I'd seen enough movies to know this would never end well.
Hold on, let me take a quick picture at least,
Jack said, grabbing his phone from his pocket.
And I gotta get rid of these eggs,
Noah protested.
Unload them in the house,
Jack ordered. By the time I heard the first egg crack against the wall, I was already halfway through the front door. When my sneakers hit the sidewalk, Merv's car pulled back into the street. As the automatic garage door clunked open and Merv pulled into the driveway, Noah and Jack came scrambling.
F you, old man,
Jack yelled, launching an egg at the windscreen. Merv got out of the car, but quickly realized he wouldn't be able to catch them. There wasn't much fight in him. I watched from across the street as he trudged into his house and slammed the front door shut. When I got home, my parents were asleep, and though I was shaken from what I'd seen, the guilt stopped me from waking them. Yes, Merv was creepy, and it was strange what we had seen. But I didn't like the idea of trashing an old man's house just because we knew we wouldn't be punished. Eventually, I fell asleep until I was awoken in the early hours by a blood-curdling scream. Joining the crowd of onlookers, I watched in horror as Jack's father ran from the house, screaming for help and holding his son. Jack's limbs had been broken and tied behind his back like a large Christmas bow. Jack's mouth was slightly ajar, and on closer inspection, the top of his phone could be seen sticking out from under his front teeth. I watched the paramedics try to dislodge it from his throat before giving up after checking his pulse. A quiet chuckle came from beside me. Glancing over, my eyes met with Merv's and a slight smile formed on his face. "Shh," Merv mouthed, raising a finger to his lips. I froze in fear, and as if on cue, another incoherent scream echoed throughout the cul-de-sac. It was Noah's mother. My father later told me she had found her son in bed with his neck twisted so many times it snapped off the last remaining threads of flesh when she pulled his body close. Noah's head had rolled onto the carpet, leaving a trail of yellow yolk-like liquid. The smell of rotten eggs stained the house for months. Paramedics understood the loss of life now made it a crime scene and attempted to disperse the crowd. When I told my parents about Merv, I think they believed my story about the dolls, even forwarding the information to the police. But my mother could only offer an awkward laugh when I accused Merv of magic. Potential charges of stalking and harassment had been mentioned at the dinner table. Still, there was never any talk of murder. My family, along with others on the street, moved the moment they could afford it. There's a certain amount of guilt I feel when the thought of Noah and Jack float back into my mind. My guilt stems from the wave of relief that washes over me. Relief that my friends met that gruesome fate rather than myself. Though I don't live anywhere near that street anymore, I often wonder if our dolls are still moving around under Merv's supervision. Or if he simply shelved us and started anew.
And boy, what a mistake that was. Oh, by the way, was Merv the Perv the same guy who snapped photos of the trick-or-treaters on his doorstep in our first tale of the night? It's sort of like we have 4 stories with the same house, isn't it? Thank you for coming out tonight, my spooky friends. Please remember, on your way out, to monster mash that subscribe button and click the Frankenchime next to it. This will ensure that the elder gods of YouTube alert you when our next tale or collection of tales premieres. And if you enjoyed these tales tonight, please hit the like button. Until next time, sweet nightmares.
Welcome, my friends, to Devil's Night. I am your host. You can call me the Creeper of Channel X. Tonight's tale explores the true meaning of the night before Halloween. Many think it's a night to play pranks on your neighbors. Is it? Perhaps, but there is more. Please enjoy tonight's presentation, titled Devil's Night. Devil's Night. The night before Halloween. All Hallows Eve, Eve. Some call it Mischief Night, but those who do miss the point entirely. They even tried to change the name to Angel's Night in Detroit. They hosted entire teams of volunteers to try to prevent the hundreds of building and home fires that would be set. The volunteers would patrol neighborhoods beginning at dusk, with the goal of creating a presence that would stop the monsters from lighting the fires to begin with. And if they lit one anyway, the Angel's Night volunteers would have immediate contact with authorities to send the closest fire department to extinguish the problem. Sure, it worked for a while, but that only allowed the public consciousness to regain focus on the true meaning of Devil's Night. It's not about fires. The fires are simply a distraction, a redirection. Some say it's the one night every year that you can do literally anything you want, and it would be accepted by your community as part of the price of living there. You give for 364 days, and you take whatever you want for one. In my town, it's not uncommon to see armed residents on the rooftops of their homes and businesses, brandishing shotguns from the time it gets dark until the rooster crows in the morning, signaling that it is once again safe to go about your daily routines. But that never stopped us. We knew where and where not to go. My usual group and I went out after 11 p.m. to begin the night's festivities. Brent was 16 and just got his license, so he was driving us that night. In the trunk, we had bags full of toilet paper, eggs, paintball guns, and a few other goodies. We all met up at Brent's place, where we pushed his dad's Delta 88 down the street until we were at a safe distance, at which point Brent jumped in the driver's seat and started it up. We all piled in and headed off.
You really think it's safe to take your dad's car without asking?
I asked Brent.
I do whatever I want. He doesn't have to know.
Brent replied. We had a list of appointments we had to keep throughout the night. First up was Mr. Johnson from Johnson's Corner Store. This guy was always a jerk to us. Whenever we'd enter the store, he'd start bitching. If I took more than 15 seconds between entering and taking what I want to the register to pay, he'd start up again.
You sure you have money? What are you trying to find? Are you stealing from me?
If any one of us looked at a magazine, he'd yell,
You gonna read it or you gonna buy it? Put it down or pay for it.
We parked down the block from his house to avoid detection, and took just what we needed on foot. We covered his tree in toilet paper, then each launched an egg at his windows as we took off running. Just when we had reached the car, We heard Johnson coming out of his front door and scream something at us. I don't remember what it was, but I'm sure it was something like,
"You gonna pay for those eggs?"
We did. We did pay for those eggs, and we bought them from someone else's store, just to add insult to injury. We were gone before he had any chance of figuring out who it was, and it was too dark to see faces that far away anyway. After that, we completed hits on 3 more run-of-the-mill jerks, all well deserving of it. There was Betty, the town busybody, who was always trying to get everybody in trouble for everything. She once claimed to my parents that my friends and I had thrown rocks at her windows. It wasn't true. I had never even been near her house, let alone thrown anything at it. I didn't even know where she lived at the time. I got grounded for a month for it because my dad believed her without evidence and didn't believe me. Since I had to pay for a crime that I did not commit, I figured it only fair that we actually commit that crime now to make it even. Next up was Mr. Shalen, who was always trying to get teen girls to come hang out with him at his house. He would regularly try to become friends with them by giving them music or movies that he knew they liked. He even tried it with Joey's sister. Joey took the honors of the first egg at this guy's house. We also did a nice drive-by egging of Travis Becker's house. Travis was a 17-year-old who bullied all of us and anybody else who was smaller than him at school. You know the type. Football player, shiny teeth, thinks he's God's gift. We didn't want Travis's parents to be mistaken about why their house was targeted, so we made sure to yell some obscenities with the name Travis attached to the end as we were making our getaway. Pretty great night so far. Here's where things start to get hairy. Next on our hit list was Mr. Farley, a history teacher from our high school. He's the teacher who was always into everybody's business. If you were having a friendly tiff with someone in the hallway, he'd be the one to threaten detention to everyone involved, regardless of who did what. He was also that teacher who would stop and question you if you were in the hallway during class, whether you had a pass in your hand or not. In fact, once when I was using the bathroom during class, I could swear that he came into the bathroom to harass and scare me. I was in a stall when I heard the door open, and I heard his familiar stomp walk coming in. I heard him using the urinal, but instead of hearing him walk out the door afterward, I heard nothing. I didn't even hear him wash his hands. Like he was just standing there, waiting for me to come out of the stall so he could demand to see my pass, or otherwise question what I was doing there. I even think I heard him sniffing and getting close to the stall door. After that sound stopped, I hurriedly got myself together, opened the door, and expected to run past him. But he wasn't there. Somehow, he left without me hearing it. Farley lived down a dirt road in the area of town where you'd expect to see a lot of fields, maybe even a few farmers. We parked down the road. It was pretty scary, to be honest, because there were no streetlights out here in this countrified area of town. We were basically walking through complete darkness in the middle of the night, where anything could happen and nobody could see it. The only lights were dim porch lights on some of the sparsely placed houses in the distance. After we walked for maybe 10 seconds, I turned to look back at the car, but it was so dark that I couldn't see it anymore. We had a special package for Farley. This wasn't a completely original plan, but we thought it would be funny to see him fall for it. Earlier in the night, while Steve cleaned up the gifts that his dog left in the backyard, he prepared a brown paper sack full of this magnificent treat, reserved for Mr. Farley. Steve set the bag on the porch, took out a lighter, and set it ablaze. The rest of us launched an entire carton of eggs at the house, one by one, and then started running back toward the car. As we were running, I turned to look over my shoulder and saw Farley open his front door, look down at the flaming bag, and then turn his head in our direction and just stare. He didn't bother with the flaming bag. He let it burn. He knew what this was. A few seconds later, I took another look over my shoulder to see Farley's shadow backlit by his porch light. He jumped off of the porch and ran in our direction.
"Oh God, he's coming!"
I yelled.
"What?"
yelled Joey. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw the car appear to emerge from the darkness as we ran toward it. We all jumped in, and Brent started it up. As the tires were spitting up dirt and we were starting to pull away, there was a loud thud from behind. When I looked back, the rear window was splattered brown. Farley had thrown Steve's doggy bag at our rear window.
Go, 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 get out of here!"
Joey screamed. We fishtailed down the dirt road and sped toward our freedom.
"Holy,"
breathed Steve.
"What the
added Joey.
Did he see any of our faces?"
asked Brent.
"I don't know,"
I answered. We were all silent for maybe 20 seconds. Our silence was then interrupted by a loud bang. Something hit the car.
"Oh, what was that?"
exclaimed Brent. I looked out the side window. Something was trailing us.
"There's something out there,"
I said.
"My dad is going to kill me. He loves this car,"
said Brent.
"This car is a piece, dude,"
said Joey.
"Oh, I'm sorry. Your car is so much better." "Oh, that's right. You don't have one,"
replied Brent. I reiterated.
"Guys, shut up. There's something following us." "What?"
replied Joey.
"I don't know. It looks like an animal or something." "Dude, we're doing 50 miles per hour. What runs that fast?"
said Brent. Nobody answered. We were quiet for several minutes.
"I'm done for tonight. This is crazy,"
said Brent, interrupting the silence.
"Let's just go to the field,"
I said. The field was what we called the playground on my street. We would hang out there at night, for lack of other places to go. We parked the Delta and went and sat at the table that we always use.
"There are huge dents in the back and side of my car,"
said Brent.
"That was crazy,"
said Steve.
"That's an understatement,"
said Joey.
"That guy is nuts,"
I added.
"I'm dead. My dad is gonna kill me when he sees that not only did I take his car without asking, but got it destroyed by some crazed lunatic,"
said Brent.
"Okay, Cameron. I just hope he didn't identify any of us,"
said Joey. We sat in contemplation for a few minutes. I was staring off into the distance at nothing in particular when I noticed a shape in the darkness that appeared to be moving.
"Guys, what is that?"
I whispered.
"What?"
asked Steve.
"That. Over there. It's moving,"
I replied. Everyone turned to look. After we all started staring, the thing looked like it realized we had taken notice of it, and it started moving faster. And it was obvious that it was moving in our direction.
"Run!"
Brent screamed. Everyone jumped up and took off toward the car. Brent attempted to get in the car to make our getaway, but it was too late. The thing was upon him as soon as he stopped running to open the door. Whatever it was on all fours. It toppled him like he was nothing. Brent let out a blood-curdling scream, which was cut off after only a split second by the thing tearing his throat out. The rest of us kept running away from the car. The three of us took cover in a backyard of one of the nearby houses. There was a barn in the back that we took shelter in, and tried to block the door by pushing a small tractor in front of it.
What are we going to do? I don't want to die,
whispered Joey.
Shut up and wait for morning,
replied Steve. Update. This is Joey. I'm finishing Bobby's story for him. I found this typed into his phone in the morning. He can't finish it himself, so I'm doing it to honor him. Last night, in the barn, we started hearing a deep growling sound from outside. It was moving around the building and stepped in front of the door, where whatever it was started knocking quietly. We all sat frozen in place, trying not to even breathe. Bobby looked at us and whispered, "Shh." I stood up as quietly as possible to see if I could see anything outside of the dusty window on the side of the barn facing the door. Whatever this thing was, it was large, like some sort of animal. It was 6 feet tall, even though it was standing on all 4 of its legs. Steve and I climbed up to the hayloft in the barn to hide. Bobby stayed hidden on the lower level, even though we asked him to come up there with us. I don't know why he stayed down there. It was then that the thing outside of the barn started speaking. In a very low, gravelly, inhuman-sounding voice, it said,
"This isn't going to look good on your permanent high school record, boys. You don't want to get in trouble now, do you?"
We all stayed silent.
"Bobby,"
it said. I don't know why he did it, but Bobby replied,
Mr. Farley?
He said. The thing then laughed quietly from outside the door, then said,
"I knew you'd do the right thing, Bobby. Let me in, and we'll talk about this."
Steve and I whispered down to Bobby,
"No, shut up. Do not get up."
But Bobby ignored us. I think it must have been his good nature, wanting to turn himself in and take his detention as punishment. He got up slowly and walked toward the door.
"Yes, that's it. Open the door, Bobby,"
the thing said. Steve and I pleaded once more through whispers.
"No, don't, Bobby. Stay away from the door."
But we were too late. Bobby's sense of morality overtook him. He pushed the tractor out of the way and opened the door. I covered my mouth with one hand and Steve's with the other to prevent us from both accidentally making a sound. From our angle, all I could see was a large, dark shadow, backlit by moonlight, staring down Bobby. This thing was not a person. It was something else. It walked slowly through the door, while Bobby walked backward, matching its pace.
"It's important that you find the true meaning of Devil's Night, Bobby,"
said the thing in its terrible voice.
This isn't about you or your friends.
It continued.
It's about us. The people of this town will surely remember after tonight.
And with that, it overtook Bobby. There was nothing he could do to fight it. It was over in an instant. Bobby now lay silent while the thing enjoyed its meal. After the thing finished, it moved back toward the door, then stopped just before exiting, and without even turning back to look, said in its demonic voice,
You boys make sure you're in school on Monday.
and then left through the door from which it entered. Silently. Neither Steve nor I spoke a word until sunrise. We climbed down from the hayloft. All that was left of Bobby was his clothing and his phone. I picked up his phone and put it in my pocket. Steve and I quietly walked outside, each going our own way home.